All right. I want to welcome everybody to this presentation. This is a very special presentation. I'm Daniel Parker with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I'm an autism and family engagement consultant at the Department of Public Instruction, and we are here today with Ben Kaufman, who is going to be assisting me with a presentation on a new resource from the Organization for Autism Research. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here, and just really excited to partner with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I think this is going to be a fantastic session.
Great. And as we move along, if those of you that are listening in, if you could just put a question in the question box if there's any difficulties with sound at any time, and we'll try to do what we can to assist. A couple of quick housekeeping items for you. If you are calling in, please make sure to dial *6. If you're having trouble with sound, there is a toll-free number that you can call, and it was sent in the presentation materials that were sent to you. If you have difficulties with the webinar, you are going to have to call the 1-800-263-6317 go-to webinar line for any assistance that you may need. I did send out copies of the presentation materials. If you did not receive those for any reason, just send me an email. I sent a batch of people who registered in the last day. I sent out some materials, but they're in a Google Docs folder. And just so you know, since it is a Google Docs folder, it works best to open those materials using Chrome or Firefox. But if you have any questions about the presentation materials, you can email me. And if anyone that you know in the future is interested in having a recording of this webinar, there is a sign up for that, and you can let them know that they can request this webinar as it is being recorded, and it will be sent out to everyone who has registered. If you have questions throughout the presentation, just feel free to type them into the question box, and we'll be pausing at various times, and we can answer your questions as well. I'm not going to read my bio, but I am Daniel Parker. I'm the Autism Consultant in the Department of Public Instruction. In the presentation materials, there's information about me. And Ben, you might need to speak up a little bit, but Ben, is there anything you want to say about OAR or about your role there?
Sure. Just real quick, the Organization for Autism Research, we are a national nonprofit. We're based in Arlington, Virginia, and our mission, simply stated, is to raise money, fund research, and change lives. What we do is we fund applied studies. We're not looking for a cause or a cure for autism, but how do we help people today? So best practices related to treatment, intervention, family support. And then the other arm of our work is doing kind of what we're doing today. We produce and disseminate resources that are of relevance for the autism community, anything from schoolhouse resources to parent support, and really our job is to just get this information out to as many people as possible. So that's a little bit of background on our organization, and like I said, we're very, very keen on partnerships with groups like the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction because it helps us reach as many folks as possible.
Great. And I know before I had met Ben, I had been using a lot of the OAR resources, and we'll be talking about a few of the additional resources in addition to the great videos that we're going to be highlighting today. You'll see some terms I sent in your PowerPoint. I'm not going to go over these, but at any time if we use a term you're not familiar with, please just type in a question in the question box and you can kind of look that over. I will be occasionally talking about the AIM Autism Internet Modules, great resource, or MPDC-ASD, the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. They have some great stuff on evidence-based practices. In addition, there's a nice definition of hidden curriculum here. We'll be talking more about that later, as well as a definition of social thinking. So those are in your packet of materials. But let's just kind of jump into the presentation. Today we're hoping that you're going to walk away with some renewed understanding of the unique neurology and learner profiles of students on the autism spectrum. Really talking a lot about how stress and anxiety impact students with autism. We're going to talk about identifying the 3 stages of meltdowns and talking about strategies to help avoid meltdowns in the school setting. And also I'm throwing in some ideas on teaching self-regulation, and we have some nice resources for further study. Ben, why don't you talk a little bit, so really the big presentation piece here is on this new resource called Understanding Autism, a guide for secondary school teachers. And Ben, tell us a little bit about what this resource is and how it came to be.
Sure. So one of the biggest concerns that when we talk to parents and we talk to teachers and folks in the autism community, one of the biggest concerns is that you've got a lot of students with autism who are in mainstream classes, particularly students in middle and high school where the social environment is extremely complex and an important part of everyday school life. And you had teachers who have students with autism in their classroom and weren't trained on best practices for how to support them. So this resource, which is a 1-hour DVD broken down into 4 different 15-minute modules, is a professional development resource that we did in collaboration with members of the research community, including Brenda Smith-Miles, who actually wrote the content outline. And we worked with Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a very large school system here in the Washington, D.C. area. I believe they're the 12th or 13th largest in the country. And what we did is we brought in teachers, general educators, anything from art teachers, science teachers, as well as special educators, parents, and students on the spectrum. And we kind of created this video with concrete strategies on how to help students with autism succeed. And we also produced, in coordination with that, we produced a supplementary manual that'll be, you can link to it from the resource sheet that Daniel sent out with all the presentation materials. And as it mentions at the bottom of this slide, it's one of 3 resources we have as part of our Autism in the Schoolhouse initiative. So this is our teacher training resource. We have another resource called the Kit for Kids, which targets peer education, specifically for elementary and middle school students. And then we have a guide called Navigating the Special Education System, which is tailored more toward parent advocacy. So this is probably the most dynamic of all the resources. And what's great about it, and you'll kind of see today, is that it's flexible. It can be something that teachers can access on their own at any time. We offer it free of charge. It's on YouTube. And it's also something that can be incorporated, like it is today, into a professional development presentation. We want to make sure that you know, it's something that folks can use continually and make sense in terms of the schedule that teachers have to maintain. So we designed it to be short. So if we move on to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about how they're broken down into 4 separate sections.
And one thing I want to throw out here is that although this was designed kind of with secondary teachers in mind, middle, high school, general education, how kind of giving that level of understanding to that group. When I watched this, and I've worked around students with autism for many years, I just found how it was put together and the information and the expertise of the people in these videos really being useful to anybody, special education, general education, administrators, families, other professionals, teaching assistants. So, and since, even though it's kind of geared a little bit towards secondary education, I think it's good for us to kind of know what skills do we hope students have at that level. And also a lot of the things you'll see are being implemented at the elementary level as well. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. So yes, Ben, why don't you walk us through the 4 segments of the videos that are on here?
Sure. So the first one is an introduction. Again, we designed this with general education teachers in mind, the folks who don't necessarily have the autism background. So the first segment is really about the characteristics of autism and how that manifests itself in the context of the secondary classroom. And as Daniel mentioned, this has applicability to elementary students as well. The second segment kind of moves into classroom support. So some of the things that are listed on the slide: home-based, visual supports, reinforcement. What can you do as a general education teacher to set up your classroom in a way that is conducive to learning and success for students with autism? What can you do in terms of providing them individual support? And a lot of these strategies, what's great, work for typically developing students as well. that's the second segment. And the third segment is going to kind of be what we're focusing on today, segment 1 and 3 really, and that's practices for challenging behavior. So what are the stages of a meltdown, and how can teachers properly and productively intervene at each stage? And then the fourth section is about, what support is available to you as an educator. So what is the IEP, how to follow an IEP, collaborating as a team, so working with special education teachers, using them as a resource, using para-educators or classroom assistants as a resource. So we tried to hit kind of the 4 major content areas, and they all, like I said, they all kind of work really well with each other. But again, it's something where if your school is interested in doing this sort of training and you only have time for one segment, you can tailor it to whatever is your highest need area at the time.
And again, today we're going to be discussing, we thought for our purposes, since we were doing 2 webinars together, we have another one coming up in a couple weeks where we'll be sending the registration out. I know it's been sent out to some groups. I'll be sending it out shortly to Wisconsin groups. Is we are going to do the first and the third one together, because we're going to talk a little bit about kind of characteristics of autism today, and then also the piece around the meltdown. And then in our next one, we'll be talking about some different supports in the classroom to engage learners and that collaborative teaming piece. Just really quick, just to get us thinking here, those of you that are online, and it's nice, we have 93 attendees right now, could you type in an answer to this question? Whether you're a parent, a teacher, a teaching assistant, a professional, what for you is the most difficult as you're teaching students with autism, and in particular, if this is the case, navigating general or special education curriculum, and with a specific focus on what skills. Ben and I will both be able to see these, so this will be nice, useful information. So we're just going to take about a 20-second break for you to fill in some of that information. The second piece we would like you to quickly discuss is really quickly just type your answer to this question. How would you describe students or children with autism? What are some typical descriptions that you hear? Just kind of getting our pre-thinking going here of what is autism. What does that mean to you? What do you think are significant definitions? And we'll pause again really quick. All right. And unfortunately with our webinar system, I wish we had one where everyone can see everyone what they're writing. I will make sure to try to send a script of this to everyone. Unfortunately, the webinar system does not allow for that. Just to let you know some of the things that are coming out, I'm seeing lots of work on people commenting on social communication skills, functional skills, inferencing, communication as a team, working together with other teachers. Independence is huge. People wanting to know good information about the meltdowns. So there's some really good things in here that people are communicating in here. So this is great information, and we'll make sure that we kind of send this off. As far as people's comments about autism, I'm reading some things about difficulty with social awareness. We're going to be talking a lot about that today. Different ways of processing. A lot of people are talking and making comments about how intelligent, how focused some of these students can be on their interest area, but also with the anxiety and some of those other difficulties. Many comments coming in about people having difficulty knowing when and how to do certain types of things and needing a lot of structure and support. And again, some nice comments about the sensitivity of many of these students, being very sensitive to their environments. Ben, do you have anything to add as these are coming in?
No, it's interesting. Folks want to know a lot about how to deal with meltdowns, and the specifically the component about trying to keep a classroom on track while the student is having a meltdown. And I think some of the items that we're going to go over today and some of the things that we focused on in the video kind of show you how to recognize those signs in a student even before that meltdown happens, so that you're kind of prepared at all of the stages. So I think a lot of the questions that we're seeing are going to be things that that we'll be addressing head-on today and in the second webinar later in the month as well.
Yeah, and I love one of the comments about students being misunderstood. That's going to be a big piece as well. So let's jump in. We're going to be showing some clips here. We're going to show the first clip.
Ask people to describe a child with autism, and you're likely to get a stereotype.
A child that's nonverbal.
Inside themselves, cut off from the world.
Who doesn't understand language.
They don't think the way they should think.
Rain Man. Everybody says Rain Man.
Has difficulty communicating.
Someone who's severely intellectually disabled.
While these descriptions apply to some children with autism, it's not the full picture. Once you understand what autism is and how it affects individuals, you'll be better prepared to teach students with the disorder and successfully integrate them into your classroom. Autism is a lifelong developmental disorder that affects a person's ability to communicate, form relationships, and respond appropriately to the environment. It results from a neurological condition that impedes normal brain development in the areas of social interaction and communication skills.
There are many more of these individuals in our midst than there ever have been before, and the likelihood that we're going to encounter them in our classrooms, in our communities, is extremely high.
An accurate perception of autism from the child's point of view may be hard to convey, but a comparison is useful.
If you were to say to me, how are hearing impaired individuals different from typical students, I would simply say they don't process auditory information in the same way. That's a pretty easy explanation. Visually impaired, they don't process visual information in the same way. People with autism don't process the environment in the same way. Oftentimes they can't pick out what you're talking about. They have a hard time understanding the main idea. So they're not processing the world in the way you think they are.
Autism is called a spectrum disorder because its symptoms and characteristics appear in a variety of combinations, from mild to quite severe. As a result, children on the autism spectrum range from those with extreme developmental disabilities to those with surprising intellectual abilities.
IQs can vary from an IQ of 20 to an IQ of 150 or greater. You have children with autism who are nonverbal, and then you have children with autism who know more words than a university professor. You have children with autism who would rather be by themselves, and then you have those who want friends but who do not know how to make them.
Students with autism may also exhibit extreme sensitivities to the environment, being overly distracted by the hum of a computer or feeling overwhelmed by a particular odor.
Some of our students may have hearing so sensitive that they can hear construction 3 blocks away. They may be distracted by the sound of pencil on paper. Turning of a page can disrupt them.
And sometimes it makes it extremely difficult for them, not just to stay kind of calm behaviorally and to kind of regulate their reactions to those things, but also to attend to whatever else is going on in the classrooms.
Polytheism means beliefs in many gods.
At the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum are those individuals who tend to be more adept at speaking and using language and are capable of doing so convincingly. Academically, these students tend to be very capable and, because of this, are often included in the general education classroom. However, they still exhibit many of the common characteristics associated with autism.
Someone with autism or Asperger's or any of those spectrum disorders, they're the same as
a regular person. It's just there's a little bit different about how they communicate.
Their problems are often in the areas of social skills. They have a difficult time navigating the social environment. They may have anxiety, which really compromises their ability to deal with complicated environments, and you're not going to find anything more complicated than middle school and high school.
So with that, hopefully some of that information you were able to hear okay. It is just to kind of recap some information and some background. You know, currently from the CDC, 1 in 88 children have some form of autism. It's more common in boys than girls. I talk often about it being a neurological disability, meaning that there are students who may have some cognitive deficits and difficulties, but in general we think of it kind of as a neurological difference. And so students are processing information differently, and it will affect their sensory systems and movement needs differently as well. Some of the major areas affected with autism are communication, social communication. Passion is an interest. You'll have a lot of students on the spectrum who have very intense passions and interests, and then also, again, those sensory and neurological differences. You may have heard it before, the saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So it's really important throughout this presentation to be thinking about that when we think about students on the autism spectrum. We're going to watch again a little bit on the communication video here, and so I'm going to get that one started up.
Autism impacts many areas of a young person's development, and to varying degrees. So while they may exhibit similar characteristics, no two individuals with autism are alike. Secondary school teachers should be especially attuned to their students' language and communication skills.
Okay, does anybody here know?
They can talk, and they can talk in full sentences, but their language comprehension may be quite impaired. They're often very difficult with subtle language. They don't understand sarcasm or jokes.
A child with autism may not understand humor, may need more direct instruction on, I need for you to do this, I need for you to stop doing this because. If you'll go like this, you can iron it on the back here like this. And they feel more confident when you give them clear information on how they're doing, what they're doing right, and what they're doing wrong.
Put it on his butt. Sit him on his butt. Touch.
Communication with students with autism has to be learned one student at a time. I ask my students to tell me how they want me to communicate with them. I have worked out with students that a hand gesture will indicate, don't call on me. I don't want you to call on me.
So you heard a little bit about the communication pieces and the communication needs. With the social communication, a big piece of the social communication needs comes around this idea of mindfulness. Apologies. And hidden curriculum. And a little bit of background on this. So students on the autism spectrum, many adults will talk about difficulties with, and many professionals will anecdotally notice that many students on the autism spectrum have a difficult time kind of thinking about what other people are thinking. So it's that ability to kind of have those metacognitive skills, being able to think about a social situation as you're talking to someone, thinking about how their behavior is going to affect what you're going to do next, thinking about being able to kind of read people's thoughts based on their facial expressions and those types of indicators. Definitely that another piece of that is difficulties in emotional expression. There's many people who will notice that many students on the autism, if you kind of rated a 1 as calm and a 5 as a meltdown, sometimes there's not a 2, 3, and 4. They go straight from apparently seeming calm to all of a sudden being very anxious and very stressed and kind of falling into a meltdown and having difficulty with some of that social regulation in those in-between stages. And then the other piece of that is difficulty with attributions. And attributions are those cause and effect relationships. So an attribution is kind of how we determine when something happens, why did that happen? and sometimes people on the spectrum, their interpretation of a social situation, what they think is the cause and the effect may be different. To give you a quick example, and I've heard of this often, sometimes, you know, a student, a really great example I can think of from Sherry Moyer, who wrote a book called The Eclipse Model, was talking about how her child, if someone was knocking on the door, their dog would be barking, and that hurt her child's ears, and the child would make the attribution that the dog didn't like that child. So he would say, the dog hates me, the dog hates me, because the dog was making a loud noise. And the parent, Sherry, would say, well, you know, no, it's because someone's knocking on the door. And the student's attribution, though, their cause and effect was, no, the dog's barking because it's mad at me. So oftentimes we see students on the autism spectrum, when we have them kind of talk about a social situation, they may say one thing or have a perspective that's very different from other people around them. And that can cause a lot of confusion and difficulties for that student. Oftentimes what we do is we talk to those students, and we may just tell the students that, oh no, this is what happened, and then we kind of end up in some power struggles. Sometimes, unfortunately, we end up labeling those students of trying to be manipulative or getting away with certain things. And not that there are not students with autism that are not capable of those types of behaviors, but I think more often than not, it's misunderstandings with attribution. There's misunderstandings with hidden curriculum as well. Ben, do you have anything to chime in on that?
Not on that piece. Nope.
Great. So to talk a little bit about hidden curriculum, just so people have an idea, this is a very important concept. There's been some great work by Brenda Smith-Miles. I know in Wisconsin we have Judy Endow, who's been doing, written some books with Brenda, as well as written her own information about learning the hidden curriculum. And I'm going to go ahead and just show the video from OAR that kind of talks more about what is this hidden curriculum in these social communication pieces.
Some students with autism have strong verbal abilities that suggest social and emotional maturity.
I'm very interested in the study of aquatic fish, especially freshwater. It fascinates me how a guppy can live in salt water that has more salt than the ocean itself.
Just because they can talk very intelligently to you in a monologue doesn't mean that they don't have a disability.
Wild betas will fight each other until one goes away.
Because a monologue is not a conversation. It is them telling you all the facts about their preferred subject.
So I was thinking of going to the mall on Friday. Should we, guys?
Yeah.
That's what you guys
You guys are going to the mall?
Yeah, we are.
Can I come?
I don't. Maybe, I don't know. We don't. Our moms can't give us how to explain it.
But what we know is social emotionally, our kids are 1/3 to 2/3 of chronological age. And so a child who is 12, who has high-functioning autism, has the social skills of someone who is between 4 and maybe 8 years old.
Many of these students also lack basic social skills.
What do you guys want to play? Did you guys see the full moon last night?
What song are you singing to get in?
I don't know. I can't decide on a song because there's so many songs.
One time I won a softball tournament and we were crowned the champions.
The rules and interactions of casual conversation, which most typically developing children understand, are often lost on them.
To interact with someone, you have to know how to take turns in conversation. You have to know how to interpret their facial expressions and their gestures. You need to be able to ask questions. Now, those are all challenges that are seen within individuals with autism.
It's a lot harder for, I think, people with autism sometimes to watch what we say, because sometimes we don't really understand what the right thing to say is. You know?
The unwritten rules and codes of social interactions, which students with autism often find elusive, are called the hidden curriculum.
It's everything about the environment and the world that somehow we just know. You know, for example, you just know that when you get on a public bus and there's only one person on the bus, that you just know that you don't sit next to him. But how do we know that? No one never said, please never get on a bus and sit next to them if there's only one person on the bus. And yet, interestingly enough, right, the kids with autism, they're inclined to sit next to the person because they've been drilled for years that you should be social, that you shouldn't ignore people.
The hidden curriculum is a term that's used for all of the unwritten social rules, kind of the social nuances that we all understand and respond to, even though they aren't explicitly discussed and possibly no one ever told us. Because those things are so subtle, many individuals on the autism spectrum miss them completely. So they don't understand, how do I modify how I behave with somebody who I'm very close to versus someone I barely know? How should I behave when I'm in the classroom versus when I'm on the bus versus on the playground?
There's lots of different reasons why you might not be invited to do something. So you should never assume that it's because someone dislikes you.
Many schools offer interpersonal skills development courses for students with autism, in effect teaching directly what most children learn intuitively from daily experience.
You know, one of the most striking things I think from that video that I have found of interest is when Brenda Smith-Miles says that students on the autism spectrum are 1/3 to 2/3 social emotional age as neurotypical students. You know, in general is what she is saying. And I think of a student, so if you think of somebody who is 15, and then you think of a student 1/3 of 15 being 5, you know, that's a real significant difference there in terms of, you know, that student's social emotional and how they react in different situations. A big piece of the social thinking and these social communication skills, you know, that literal thinking, that direct and literal thinking can lead to all kinds of difficulties with understanding humor, sarcasms, taking directions literally, figurative language, so understanding those meanings of idioms and hyperboles and metaphors. So those would be things, you know, like when people use common expressions for exaggerations, those can be very confusing to students. Even saying things like, get a tissue and throw it in the trash. Well, for most people, they would assume, okay, there's other things I need to do with that tissue. But a student on the spectrum may literally go over to the tissue, pick it up, and throw it in the trash. Another example might be, we're going to have a spelling test today, or it's time for our spelling test. Well, for most people, that means get out your book, take a piece of paper out, number it 1 through 20, write your name at the top, and we're going to take the spelling test. But for a student with autism, it may just mean, okay, we're going to have a spelling test today. So, you know, sometimes those more general statements really need to be broken down if you see students having difficulty with those types of skills. So being very direct and instructive in breaking down those steps to task can be very helpful as well. One piece that a lot of people in Wisconsin have started using is the idea of social thinking. It'll be interesting to know who all is using social thinking. The social thinking in general is the ability to know our own plan, reading someone else's plan, and adapting as needed so that both parties remain engaged and feeling good about the experience. That comes from the incredible Flexible U, which is a social thinking curriculum for preschool students. But I think it's social thinking is being used teaching students with social communication difficulties and a lot of students with autism from early childhood all the way through adulthood, quite frankly, in private practices. And some of the pieces with social thinking is really thinking about not just our verbal communication, but also knowing what not to say or when to say nothing. There's a strong emphasis in teaching students those nonverbal communication skills and a strong emphasis on students kind of trying to figure out their own or others' behavior. A couple other things here with social thinking and hidden curriculum. Social thinking and hidden curriculum are kind of entwined a little bit. The Michelle Garcia winner, who's done a lot of work and kind of founder of social thinking in many ways, a lot of her work, has written a book called Think Social. And some of the hidden curriculum ideas and concepts are actually some lessons within that Think Social curriculum. But social thinking and hidden curriculum, they both recognize those social rules and expectations which are not traditionally taught. They really that there's a really heavy emphasis that to understand these social rules that they really need to be learned and taught on a regular basis. Students just don't pick them up. And also talking about how students learn these social rules. And social thinking specifically discusses hidden curriculum and aspects of that within that social thinking curriculum. So hidden curriculum is kind of one component of social thinking. And if you want to know more about hidden curriculum, Brenda Smith-Miles has written some books on hidden curriculum, and there's also a really good book, Learning the Hidden Curriculum, The Odyssey of One Autistic Adult. It's a great, it talks about the methodology kind of for learning the hidden curriculum, and it has a lot of, not just talks about what is hidden curriculum, but kind of how Judy learned to kind of pick up on cues in her environment to figure out kind of what is happening within the hidden curriculum. You know, both of those recognize that there's, and another piece with social thinking that's a little different than social skills. So, you know, when I started out teaching, we did a heavy emphasis in teaching social skills. So those were things like eye contact and taking turns and joint attention. And those are all very important skills. But if you ever watch a group of children playing kind of at any age level, you know, children don't take turns in a conversation typically. There's all kinds of other skills such as knowing how long to talk about something you're interested in, knowing when to ask other people what they're interested in, being able to maintain a topic of someone else's interest. There's a whole bunch of other skills, and to be able to do that, you really need that ability to be able to kind of pick up those cues from other people and know how to engage them in communication and in social communication. So, you know, both social skills training and social thinking look at those needs of students with social communication deficits and differences, but social thinking focus more on that metacognitive piece, whereas social skills typically focus more on rote skills. So I have kind of a slide here that kind of shows the difference between social thinking and social skills. Again, social thinking, you know, an example of a social thinking would be discussing what other people are thinking when you're not looking at them. So if you're in a conversation with someone and you're not looking at them, that means that maybe you're not interested in them. And typically we don't talk about that. We tell students with autism it's important to look at people, but we don't necessarily get into explaining why that may be important. And we know for a lot of students with autism, eye contact can actually be very distracting. It can make it more difficult to pay attention. So, you know, sometimes depending on the student, it may, you know, if you're teaching interview skills or something to a student, it might be a good practice to teach them to look at someone when you begin talking, and then it's okay to look away, because that's what most of us do, and check in at various points. But we also need to explain what other people might be thinking when we're not looking at them. A couple other examples here. You know, a social thinking curriculum would be trying to teach knowing how to tell if other people are interested in your conversation, whereas in social skills, we teach people how to initiate a conversation, and that's great, but it's also important for a student to learn how if someone's interested. When you do initiate conversations, how can you tell if they're interested in that conversation, and what do you do if you don't think the person is interested in that conversation, so what to do. So those are just a few ideas of kind of the differences between those two. Really quick, those of you, and we're going to take some comments from some people in the field here as well, talking about how they use social thinking. But right now, let's take a quick break and type your answer into the question box. Think of an example of information, hidden curriculum, social knowledge, which you have seen cause some confusion or anxiety that has made a misunderstanding for a student or child with autism, and we'll read those back. All right. As a few of these come in, I'm going to read a few of the things that are coming in here. You know, someone talked an example of an observation of a teacher tell a student, go to the circle table, and the student started walking around in a circle around the table. I know that when I was teaching, there was a student and the teacher had a signal, said, give me 5, and the student would literally go up to the front of the classroom and want to give the teacher a high 5. And it's those types of confusions for students that can be very confusing and at times stigmatizing and can lead to bullying and other difficulties for students. All right. You know, a lot of people are commenting on students having difficulties of when to stop talking about personal interests and those types of things. I'm going to bring on Rachael Medal now, and she is a teacher who does a lot of social thinking curriculum. Rachael, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you do with social thinking curriculum in your classrooms.
Okay, I also use Michelle Garcia Winner's Superflex social thinking curriculum. I use it with a small group of kiddos, not just on the autism spectrum, but a couple people who have a hard time really thinking about how their friends view them. I kind of use the curriculum as a stepping stone for conversations to be had in their natural settings. So I try to be outside for recess time to kind of catch some of those things happening in action so we can kind of target them in a small group. But we talk a lot about their actions and how people view them when they've acted a certain way. So thinking of some examples at recess time outside, issues on the playground, and if kiddos are bumping into them, we have conversations about how do you think your friend felt about you and what were they thinking about you when you did that. So it's a good stepping stone to have that direct instruction about the fact that other people are always thinking about what you're doing, just like they're thinking about teachers at times when they're asking them to do something, but kind of opening that conversation for them to be thinking about what others think of them.
And Rachael, how often do you teach the social thinking curriculum?
We typically meet once a week, but the conversations happen on a daily basis. The curriculum Superflex often uses different superheroes to talk about different topics. So the nice piece of that is we can talk about those superheroes or supervillains really that make us not so flexible thinkers at any time during the day, which is kind of a nice piece of it. I can say, oh dear, I think, you know, that's kind of a glass man sort of a thought. So the idea is really to get them to be flexible thinkers about everyone else.
Yeah, and I know that the social thinking curriculum is really good at using certain terminologies, like and road signs, like a detour means that you go off topic. And instead of telling the student, and kind of, sometimes when we do give corrections, it can be very punishing for students, but social thinking curriculum has done a great job of giving us some terminology and kind of making it fun. Do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. The piece comes with different graphic novels that the students get to read in small groups. It's also very hands-on. The lessons are intended to be really engaging. Kids are superheroes. The Superflex is the main character. But all of the different pieces of kind of negative social thinking are these villains in their life. And so I believe there's about 20 different villains that kind of come into play. And that's exactly it, is that you can kind of use that vocabulary to reference at any different time. So Rock Brain, for example, is the team of unthinkables that kind of gets stuck and doesn't want to negotiate. And so oftentimes when kids are interested in something specific and continue to talk about their special interest, it's a good time to say, oh gosh, I think that kind of sounds like a rock brain sort of thought, and how can you be more flexible?
All right, thank you for sharing some of the social thinking curriculum that you are using in your school. We're going to go ahead and move along a little bit here, and I want to show you the importance of the social thinking in hidden curriculum, and I'll give you a couple quick examples too of why hidden curriculum can be so critically important. Some people talked about bathroom etiquette. Someone wrote on there that bathroom etiquette is very hard. And pretty much anytime I go see a talk on hidden curriculum, I usually hear this example, whether it's Judy or Brenda Smith-Miles, so it's a pretty common example of why hidden curriculum can be very important, is, imagine that, you're a student and you go into, a male student, you go into the bathroom and you have 4 urinals lined up there. Well, most students, and if there's already a boy or a man at number 1, most students on the autism spectrum, unless they're taught about the etiquette of what you do in a bathroom, might go stand next to person number 2. They may not go to number 4 because, guys just know that. You don't stand next to another guy when you go into the bathroom when you're using a urinal. Also, unlike, somewhat unlike maybe what I've heard of, gender differences, men typically don't talk to each other than very brief words in the bathroom. But if you're not taught that hidden curriculum and you're a young man on the autism spectrum and you do not display those types of behaviors, you're setting yourself up to be bullied. And if you're out in the community, you're really setting yourself up to possibly be in a lot of safety in difficult situations if there are sexual predators or people that are going to take advantage of someone who might not understand those social rules. And a lot of those social rules change with time as well. So things that are completely appropriate for a 5- and 6-year-old, all of a sudden when you're 10, 11, 12, or 16 or 17, are no longer appropriate at all. Imagine seeing a 10-year-old boy on a swing in a park, but if you saw a 19-year-old boy on a swing on a park, you might dial 911, wait to see what happens, because that's not something you typically see. So we have to be really careful with making sure that students are being taught these social curriculum rules. And we're going to watch a quick video kind of how this misunderstanding with hidden curriculum and social thinking can cause to a lot of difficulties for students on the autism spectrum.
So that's the girl that you like? The one over there?
Oh, nice.
Go tell her she's fat. She'll love it.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Girls love hearing. While the personal development classes help prepare students with autism for everyday situations, they can't prepare them for everything.
You look fat. Why would you say that to me?
They don't recognize often that they're being bullied. So they're bullied a lot longer. I think that the fact that their language is compromised, the fact that they don't know they're being bullied, the fact that they do these kind of odd things that make them prime targets.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that.
No way.
So there's a kind of, obviously these were some students who were kind of acting the situation out, but I have seen and heard of this type of situation often. And even in kind of more scary situations, and this happens to our young men, especially with autism or Asperger's, where they may find themselves in situations with inappropriate touch, where in many cases, they're not really taught those social rules of what's acceptable in terms of touching, and that can lead to police being called, all kinds of difficulties with suspensions, expulsions, and a lot of those difficulties. Ben, do you want to chime in on any of that as well?
Yeah, and in addition to not just the potential consequences in terms of even legal implications and things like that for folks on the spectrum, you think about that in the context of especially secondary school, when social standing is such an important piece of the experience, and you think about an incident like that you saw in the video and how damaging that can be to a student, because that's gonna be their reputation going forward, and that kind of speaks to peer education, which I'm glad we pulled up this current slide with all the resources related to bullying. And we know from research that the more students know about a disability, the more accurate information that they have, the less incidences of bullying and the less misunderstanding there's going to be. So I think it's really important as educators that you're making every effort to educate other students about students with autism, and it's likely that those types of incidences that may happen because the student doesn't understand the hidden curriculum, it will make it a lot easier for students on the spectrum to recover from those kinds of incidents, rather than falling into a cycle of depression or seeing those high levels of anxiety that are so prevalent among especially adolescents on the spectrum.
Great. And we do have some great resources. I know that the Department of Public Instruction has some good general bullying resources. PACER has some good things. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about that kit for peers education resources and the What's Up for Nick? That's a good resource for bullying.
Yeah, this is our our peer education solution. We created this last year, and it's a whole kit of materials, and it's a peer-to-peer lesson plan. So it's designed with elementary and middle school students in mind for students who may be very responsible or very well respected to present to their peers about autism. It can also be done by a teacher, parent. I'm actually personally an older sibling, so it's something I could have gone into my younger brother's classroom and presented. But it's a book that that follows the story of a young boy named Nick and his classmates, and how they came to understand that he's different, but he's still just a member of the class like everybody else. It's very non-stigmatizing, and it comes with a booklet, a lesson plan, and a classroom poster that can stay in the classroom after the lesson is given to kind of reinforce concepts. Later this month, we're going to be adding a series of activity workbooks for students in grades K to 1, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and 6 to 8 as kind of independent activities that they can do, again, to reinforce concepts, to feel as connected to the material as possible, and to really feel a sense of ownership over how they treat their classmates with autism. And then we're also working for 2014 on an e-learning website for typically developing students, again, to do activities and to learn more about autism in kind of a fun game sort of way. So we're really, in addition to the videos that you're seeing, we're really pushing for peer education because, again, we know what research says, and it's that kids who are more informed about a disability tend to be more empathetic. So that's just a kind of snapshot, and as the link is on there, you can access all these materials online, and we're OAR is very keen on partnering with school districts that are looking to kind of roll out peer education on a broader level.
Great, thank you. And I know in Wisconsin, just those of you that are in Wisconsin or anywhere for that matter, in Wisconsin we have a nice group called Good Friends Inc., and they're a nonprofit group who goes around and does some work with schools around setting up and talking about autism specifically. It's a couple parents of students with autism, and they've created some really nice videos. I believe they won an award once for their DVDs around, and they're very short, and it's peers and students with autism and their friends talking about how to be a good friend for a student with autism, and they talk a little bit about the neurology of autism and some of the things, and kind of explain in a kid-friendly way. And they have one for younger students and one for older, and again, that's called Good Friends Inc. I'll kind of type that into the chat area here in a minute, which might be a nice resource if people are looking for things to share in classrooms. Asking families to come in also can be a good piece. Not all families, are as comfortable doing that, but many families are comfortable. And obviously having the student talking and learning about how they want to communicate, or if they want to communicate about their needs and interests. And a big piece of that is just teaching peers and people in the community that students with autism are just like anyone. They have their likes, their dislikes, their needs, their supports, and just trying to kind of break that down for everyone. This next piece is going to kind of guide us into talking about the organization needs of student with autism, and it's also then going to get us into talking about that stress and anxiety piece that is such a big piece of making sure that we are helping support our students on the autism spectrum.
In the secondary classroom, teachers will likely see students with autism struggle with basic skills.
For the most part, organizing their materials, organizing the sequence of tasks that they should do are often formidable challenges for individuals with autism. From a teaching perspective, it's probably the way in which students with autism in your classroom are most high maintenance. So kind of getting them on track, reminding them of what they ought to be doing, noticing that they're not doing steps 2, 3, and 4 that they're supposed to be doing.
Their anxiety levels can be very high when they feel like they're confronted with a whole lot of information at once, a whole lot of steps at one time.
And the more they fall behind and the more disorganized they get, the more anxious they get, which then leads to the potential for behavior problems.
All right. So that piece kind of just talked about the organization piece, and then linking that a little bit with how that can build up, and if things, especially in our traditional classroom settings, there's a lot going on. Students really have to anticipate what's coming next. They have to be able to kind of abstractly think and put in order all the steps to accomplish, moving from one activity to another, and that can take up a great amount of energy and thinking for students on the spectrum, and gradually kind of raise that anxiety level. And when we think about students with autism, we kind of need to think about how they're built. This is a slide that I've used in other presentations. And the top part of the slide here, the top of the iceberg, this is kind of what we see for a student with autism, but down here is kind of all of that life experience. It's that neurology, it's all of those pieces of that can that we need to be aware of, that there's so much more to a student when they walk into our classroom than sometimes what we see on the surface. And stress and anxiety has been associated with autism as early as the first descriptions of autism. They can lead to meltdowns, self-injurious behavior, excessive routines, difficulties in work and relationships, and certainly in school. An interesting piece, I used to work out at the Groden Center in Rhode Island, and they did a lot of work on self-regulation for students with autism, but they also did a lot of work on monitoring kind of those physiological responses to stress. And one of the things that they found was that many students on the autism spectrum have higher resting heart rates than neurotypical students. So that means that just sitting in a room relaxed, the heart rate is a little bit higher for some students on the autism spectrum than it is for typical people and neurotypical people. And if you think about what happens when you become stressed and everything goes up, they're kind of going up even higher in their physiological response. And there's people like Temple Grandin and John Elder Robeson, who are adults with autism, who have written extensively about that piece of fear and anxiety playing big parts in their lives even to this day, even though they're very successful people. Here's a little graph from the Groden Center that Dr. June Groden let me borrow, and it kind of shows this higher line here of a resting heart rate of a person with autism doing an activity, and then a neurotypical person doing the same activity side by side, just to kind of give you an example, a graphic design of that difference in just kind of the physiological aspects of some people on the spectrum. And you've probably heard the term fight, flight, or freeze. I particularly love that freeze idea, because it's not just kind of when you're stressed you either flee, you either fight or flee, but that freeze aspect is huge. We have some students that just kind of freeze. And stress and anxiety can do that due to all of those physiological rates. Another piece of this is, if you have a neurology that causes stress and anxiety, you're going to probably behave at times in a stressful manner, but think about, how do we respond to people who are stressed and anxious? How do we talk to them? what is our body language, and what do we give back? What types of directions do we give? And then think of that kind of self-esteem and self-efficacy component too. It kind of just turns into kind of a cycle of just causing more stress, and it's kind of a little bit of a cycle there that students can get. This is a bumper sticker that we've shared before. It just says that if you think you're stressed, try having autism. So we're going to watch this. This is moving us into this third video, Practices for Challenging Behavior. And we're going to take a look at this video, and it's going to talk more about those introductions to meltdowns and those types of difficulties.
Students with autism often find changes in their environment or daily routine difficult to manage. A change in class schedule, in a teacher's instructions, or peer interactions can cause stress to build. What frequently results is a student who's already anxious becoming even more anxious.
He'll start to fidget. He'll start to rock. He'll start to look around, and then he'll start to move. He might even get up out of his chair.
He starts tensing up and stressing and having tics.
If unrecognized, these escalating stressors can lead to sudden and challenging behaviors. The most severe forms are commonly called meltdowns.
Meltdowns can be unbelievable, right? They can be about as violent as you can imagine from an individual who is just not violent.
Okay, stop it! Stop it! You're not allowed to do that, teacher! He's using his phone and...
Here's the kid sitting at his desk, doing his work, and you walk over and you straighten his pencil on his desk, and that's it. He jumps up, he throws his desk, he may start hitting himself. It can range from that severe to screaming.
At school, a meltdown could look like banging on a desk. It could look like screaming at a teacher. It can look like a really weird face.
He was yelling. It took 2 adults to help him get out of the classroom and go to the vice principal's office and try to get him to calm down.
For students with autism, meltdowns occur when a situation, a task, or unforeseen stimuli overwhelms their ability to control their anxiety. And for many, it starts with being unaware of their feelings and emotions.
First of all, they can't tell that they're a little bit upset, or they're overwhelmed, or they're anxious. The next issue is some of our students have a difficult time matching emotion to event. For example, if our student misses 2 words on a spelling test, it's the end of the world, because he doesn't understand that really in life 2 spelling words, not a big deal, and the way you react to it is to say, oh well, if I want to do better, maybe I'll study harder next time. The next issue is once our children become upset or overwhelmed, they have difficulty calming themselves down.
There's nothing deliberate about a meltdown. It's not purposeful behavior directed at teachers or other students, but it can bring about a dramatic change in the affected student, whose behavior can be very disruptive to the class and an unsuspecting teacher.
When Nicholas gets upset, his anxiety peaks, and then the defiance comes, and it doesn't look like he's a child with autism. It looks more like he's a defiant teenager.
I have to go to the bathroom.
When they occur, meltdowns are the way a student with autism releases pent-up frustration. But the reason behind them varies.
Many things can cause meltdowns. A lack of predictability is one. Participation in social situations where the child does not understand what he should do. Not being able to get assistance when needed. Having too much or too little sensory stimuli.
It tends to be triggered when a student can't grasp a concept, or they're frustrated with something that we're talking about in class that they just don't seem to get. If you're asking a student to do something that they don't want to do, that can also trigger it.
I mean, each student is going to be different, and each meltdown situation is going to be created by different circumstances. So You know, when there's a meltdown or if there's a meltdown, I would say that you need to maintain your calm because you getting agitated does not help the situation at all.
While students with autism may not sense them coming on, meltdowns rarely happen without warning. It's up to the teacher to see the signs.
So one of the pieces of kind of this meltdown curve, we're going to be talking about the stages of a meltdown. And this is an anxiety curve that someone shared with me once. And it kind of talks about, you know, a student going up the curve. So you imagine the top of the curve is kind of the meltdown. And then the bottom of the curve is kind of that coming back off of that meltdown. And it kind of talks a little bit about where do we teach? You know, do we teach when the student is having a full-blown meltdown as they're going up? And what do we do? And in this next set of videos, I just kind of want to bring up this curve now to kind of think of a student that has occasional meltdowns. What we're talking about when we're talking about these areas of identifying meltdowns, we're going to be talking about a rumbling phase. And that would be kind of in this redirect area. We're going to give you some strategies of how to redirect students as they're doing that rumbling phase. And then we're going to move on to this kind of phase as students kind of get into the meltdown and what we need to do for students there. And then how do we help students after a meltdown, you know, if we're not able to kind of curve that off. So there's 3 stages of a meltdown that are outlined in this in the OAR video are the rumbling, the rage or meltdown, and then the recovery phase. So let's go ahead and take a look at the rumbling phase, and then we're going to talk about some things we can do to try to identify that phase and some strategies we can do to help students when they get into this rumbling phase. So I'll go ahead and start that video here.
Students with autism may not sense them coming on. Meltdowns rarely happen without warning. It's up to the teacher to see the signs. Typically, meltdowns occur in 3 stages of varying lengths. The rumbling stage, the rage or meltdown stage, and the recovery stage. In the rumbling stage, a student begins to exhibit behaviors that are out of the ordinary. These behaviors may appear minor, but they're often telltale signs.
He may begin to drum his fingers on his desk, swing his legs, clear his throat, talk under his breath, start pacing back and forth.
I used to know it.
They might talk louder than they normally do. So what you're looking for in the rumbling stage are either these overt physiological changes where they're sweating, they're flushed, or these more behavioral changes that are different from what they normally are.
In addition, a student's behavior may become more overt in the rumbling stage, like withdrawing from others or threatening classmates verbally or physically. For teachers, the keys are to know your student, be alert, and prepared. That way, you'll be ready to respond when something isn't right.
If I sense that students with autism are under stress, I allow as much latitude as they need. I'll give whatever they need to kind of get them to come back down to their comfort zone. Some kids need to just get up and walk. They need to move. And if that's what they need to do just to kind of detox from the situations, so to speak, then do it.
The most important thing that teachers need to know are what are the warning signs. They're there. They really are.
All right, so she kind of ends there with, what are the warning signs? They are there. They really are. And so, really quick, let's take a quick break for you to just type in there. So think of a student and really try to think about the student that may have some stress and anxiety. And what are the warning signs? What does that student say? What does that student do? What physiologically can you see happening for that student? The student may say things, they may act a certain way, they may ask certain types of questions, they may have certain things that they do. So give some examples of some of that with the students you're working, or if you're in a group, you can discuss that as a group. And we'll just take about 30, 45 seconds for you to have that discussion. All right, I'm going to read through some of the ones that came in just to give the audience some examples of some of the things that people are saying. So rocking back and forth, students that just drop their head down for a few seconds, breathing hard, wanting to talk more often, growling, squinting, less eye contact, using a louder voice, verbal refusals, kind of fidgeting, moving around in the chair, starting to talk under their breath, wringing of hands, saying things like no, please, all done, please. Maybe certain types of words, like some students may get frustrated and they may have words where they say this is stupid, or they may use put downs when they start to get moving up that escalation scale for a meltdown. Some other students have the very opposite response of just staring off or becoming more quiet. Heavy breathing we talked about. Students that put a hoodie over their head, if they have a hoodie on, plugging their ears, laughing. So we're getting all kinds. So you can see that this is not going to be the same for every student. That students are going to have a whole bunch of different types of behaviors that they have at this time. At this time, I'm going to have Sue come on, and she's going to talk a little bit about how she identifies some students. And Sue, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, very well.
I'm Sue Ausavich. I'm an autism support teacher in Holmen. And I just thought I'd share a few things that we do. And, clearly from what everyone is saying, everyone's rumbling stage looks a little bit different. And so one of the things we try to be very clear about with specific kids is having a really good, short, sweet description of what that might look like. For some kids, it might include even a video or a picture, making sure those things are included with teachers' lesson plans so that when there's a new person in there, they know what it looks like, because sometimes it can just be giggling. So having that really defined for people, and even for older kids, having some peer helpers be really aware of what the warning signs look like so that we can be proactive, because that's always easier to be proactive than to be in the middle of a meltdown. So then having those strategies, whatever the strategy might be, the deep breathing, listening to music, taking a break, having that included, so making sure that everything is defined for the adults or the peers who are going to be helping. And to be sure that student has rehearsed it. One strategy we use a lot is video modeling, so we'll have videos of the student rehearsing their calming strategy, or get a peer to be rehearsing that calming strategy. And we have found that tool to be very helpful, so they've seen it over and over, so when they need to use it when they're a little upset, it's a little more ingrained. And I also just keep my little secret plan that if things aren't working, just a little distraction card. For some students, I keep Pokemon cards in my pockets, or pictures of Super Mario characters. Or we have the office call the student to run an errand. We have a little code that we call the office so they know to call that student for an errand. So to just put as many proactive strategies in place, obviously, is going to be easier. Great. And then the direct teaching, like you said, when you have that curve at the beginning and end, doing the teaching. And one of the things we use from Michelle Garcia Winter is that problem size, defining for the student problem size, so that a 1 problem is tiny. When your pencil breaks, that's a 1 problem, and a 5 problem is an emergency, like calling 911. And teaching them to have a 1-size reaction to a 1-size problem. And the earlier you can start that practicing and teaching, the better.
Thank you. And Sue, I love how you mentioned one of the strategies that we're actually going to see a video on is they use the term antiseptic bouncing, but it's sort of a redirection technique where the student is given a task to do that gets them away from the stress and anxiety, maybe away from the task briefly that might be causing that stress and anxiety or social situation or whatever it is, so that they have a chance and be able to calm down and come back to it. So that's a nice piece of that. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to move ahead also and go ahead and talk a little bit about a few of these strategies and then watch another video. One of these, having a clear schedule, one of the things that you'll see to avoid that rumbling stage, a lot of that is caused by students just not having, they may know the schedule in the sense that they can tell it to you, but having it visual, having it in front of them, referring to the schedule often. One of the strategies that we did not watch on the first set of videos is called priming. And what that does is having, before any activity, before any set of directions, is giving very explicit instructions to the student of what is going to come up next and priming that student for whatever is going to happen. As much as we can do that visually with a class schedule, or if you have written directions of how to perform a task, it's going to make it easier. And one of the things that I've been thinking more and more about with this is, although many students are very likely capable of knowing what's coming up next and knowing the steps to go through, they may be spending a lot of energy pulling up and putting all those kind of unwritten, if it's not written out or if there's not a schedule to refer to, they may be spending a lot of their kind of executive function, energy, and thinking on trying to prioritize these tasks, and then they don't have as much energy for actually completing the task. So if we can make those schedules as clear and consistent as possible, it's going to be easier for them to then complete the activities in the classroom, if that makes sense. So those written directions are key. Letting the students, choose when they want to look at those. Even having the student knowing that they're available can reduce stress. Just like it reduces stress for me to know where my phone is at all times. I don't need it at all times, but just knowing where it is comforting. Using special interests in activities and use of assistive technology are some other ideas as well that we can be looking at. So let's watch a little video here, and we're going to look at two specific strategies, the antiseptic bouncing and then home base, which can be another great strategy for students. And this is an example of home base in the general education setting, but you can also apply this to other settings as well. So let's take a look at that.
Once the teacher sees signs of a coming meltdown, it's vital that he or she promptly intervenes, but in a way that doesn't intensify the situation. Teachers can use distraction or calming techniques to help the student regain control before the onset of a full-fledged meltdown.
I think what's hugely important is to have a process in place where you as a teacher know what this child needs. You know the signs if there's a problem, and you know the resources that you then have to use to incorporate into your routine.
One intervention strategy teachers use effectively is called antiseptic bouncing, which involves separating the student from a stressful environment in a seamless and inconspicuous way.
He is picking on his eyebrows. That is the signal. You go to him and say, Mr. Johnson needs a box of Kleenex. Please take it to him. Now, Mr. Johnson doesn't need the box of Kleenex, but he knows on occasion a box of Kleenex will arrive. We want him to get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, say hello to the school secretary, peek into a couple of classrooms. He then delivers the Kleenex and then makes his way back to his classroom. During that time away from the classroom, he's been distracted and he is calmed.
Another proven intervention is sending a student to a home base, sometimes called a cool zone.
A home base is simply a place where the student can go to decompress. It is not escape from work. It can be a speech-language pathologist room. It can be a resource room. It can be a counselor's office.
I'm going to give you 5 minutes on this timer, and I'm just going to give you some space, okay?
Usually we have some type of calm down plan already set in place. or somewhere for them to go where they don't need to focus on whatever work that we're doing at that moment, to just regain their composure and calm down.
All right. And one of the things, we also have Rachael on the phone, and this is Rachael Medal again. And Rachael, do you want to say where you're from and your role as well?
Sure. I'm from the Watertown Unified School District, and I am with a 3rd grade special education.
And I know, Rachael, when we discussed this the other day, kind of the idea of antiseptic bouncing, so sending a student to another location briefly, you talked about it not only helps a student, but talk about how that can also help the teacher as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when our kiddos are getting kind of frustrated, it has a lot to do with how we're presenting information or what we're teaching. If we're not always successful in getting them engaged and making lessons meaningful to them, giving them some sort of a distraction allows me to have some more time to rethink the activity or the lesson I'm teaching, and kind of make a game plan for how I can make it more meaningful for the student. It might be just making a math problem into something that involves their special interest, or maybe it's even just giving them an explanation when they get back as to why it is I'm asking them to do what they're doing. So it kind of gives me a second to regroup as well as the student to kind of walk away from the problem and come back to address it later. Great.
Thank you for sharing that as well. So it's kind of giving that teacher that ability to take really quickly as well. I know, and Rachael and Sue, if you want to maybe, either one of you, if you want to come on this, I know a couple of the people online are saying, and it is true, these videos were created for students who are in general ed secondary settings, so the examples are very verbal students, not students we think of with classic autism, but how might you use some of these strategies for students who may be nonverbal, more movement needs, may not be able to show us, where we are having more difficulty really kind of having an idea of what the students are comprehending. What are some of the strategies that you've used to avoid meltdowns for those students? And either Sue or Rachael, if you want to jump in.
I can touch on one kiddo I'm working with currently who's doesn't use verbal communication to communicate, but I tend to offer different calming strategies when I can see some of those frustrations. Sometimes it's just a look on his face where I can tell he's starting to become frustrated, so offering different strategies to him is really important when he's not always able to communicate what it is that he needs back from me, and supporting that visually with actually the object or a picture of the object is helpful.
Great. And I know that we are going to be talking about some strategies such as coping cards. There's definitely cognitive picture rehearsal or social stories can be helpful. So just taking a break and going through a social story with the student, I think, can also be helpful. When you said taking deep breaths and doing some relaxation, I know that for students that have classic autism, progressive relaxation is a fantastic methodology for students with autism. And I'll send out some links post-webinar about some of those techniques as well.
Daniel, am I still on?
Yes.
I would just say I have used that sort of errand technique with some pretty involved kids. A short errand with something sensory built in, like carrying a heavy milk crate to the OT room. And then when they're there, they can take a quick sensory break, and then carrying that heavy item back. I've been really surprised at the kids who can do that pretty independently if it's rehearsed and really part of their routine and part of their strategies.
Sue, what I like about what you just said is if it's rehearsed. So you would probably practice carrying, carrying some books or a heavy object or doing that type of thing, not when the student is rumbling.
Right.
So that when you start to see them, their triggers, you can engage them in that task and then bring them back and kind of start over, or again, giving you that time to regroup and think about, where are you going to go next to maybe avoid this meltdown.
Right.
All right, great. With the home base, this can be any safe area of the school. It can be with any person. You want to make sure it's a place where students can thrive. You want to avoid stigmatizing the student. I saw Brenda Smith-Miles in Appleton in the last year, and one of the things she said, for some students, they're not going to want to maybe go to another part of the classroom to work separately if they're having stress or anxiety, if that's kind of a home base within a room. And she said, though, but if there's maybe a preferred peer who is asked to go over there kind of in private by the teacher first, and then go over to the student and say, hey, do you want to go over there and work with, Sarah over at the table, knowing that that area of the room might be less anxious, maybe a better place for that student at the time. They may be more willing to go there if there's another peer already over there. And you kind of set up those kind of discussions in advance and set that type of, with the peers and those types of things, and picking peers that are going to be, calming influences on the student. So there's a couple more other ideas with that. Some of those self-regulation techniques that can work well are coping cards, or just short, simple reminders for students. So they can just be visual cards that help students, kind of a reminder of what to do. You can put all kinds of things on there, like deep breaths, positive affirmations, counting backwards, different types of things. Power cards are great for students, and even nonverbal students with classic autism, if they have a special interest. A lot of kids right now love the Cars videos. So you could just take one of those pictures of one of those cars that they like and put, and even if the student is not showing you verbal reading, if you kind of go over with the student what that card means, and those power cards can have kind of a positive reminder of what to do when you're stressed or anxious. Here's an example from the Autism Internet modules with Will Smith. So this could be a cartoon character, it could be an object, it could be a person, it could be anything, and it just kind of says, here's what, Will Smith wants me to remember: stay calm when I make mistakes, stay calm when someone else makes a mistake. So a power card is a type of social narrative that students can use, and again, I would encourage you to try it with students at kind of any developmental level, because you never know, we always want to presume confidence, and a lot of our students who are nonverbal and have a lot of movement needs, if they have autism, they are still very capable of understanding a lot of the instructions that we are providing them. It's just that their sensory system and their neurological input makes it very difficult for them to kind of express that type of comprehension. But those power cards and things can be very effective at students at all levels. I've used them for all types of students. I don't know if, Ben, you want to jump in at any time, feel free. But I'm going to move along because I know we're kind of moving through here. The next phase we're going to talk about here is when we're in a meltdown. And what do we do when we're in a meltdown? So let's go ahead, and the biggest pieces with this meltdown phase is when we get to the meltdown. Number one, we have to remain calm. A lot of self-regulation and teaching self-regulation is co-regulation. If we are calm, students are more likely to be calm. If we are stressed and we move in and we give a lot of verbal language and we do and if we try to move in on a student, it's probably going to make them more stressed. So unless the student is really hurting themselves or others, it's better to back off and calm down and try to, if they're in that meltdown, that rage stage, it's better just to kind of back off and wait. Let's go ahead and watch the video on this piece of it.
If a student's anxiety is not relieved during the rumbling stage, he or she will likely enter the rage or meltdown stage. Here, the student may lose control, acting impulsively, emotionally, and sometimes explosively. At this point, behaviors range from outwardly physical, hitting, kicking, screaming, and destroying property, to internal, such as withdrawal.
What a meltdown really boils down to, it's when you're hijacked by your own emotions. You're basically you have no control. You have completely snapped. And depending on the individual, it can range from I'm just going to scream and cry and run out of the room to I'm going to throw tables.
So, first rule,
stick with your group.
Lisa's son, Paul, has meltdowns that vary in appearance.
Meltdowns look like very different things depending on where you are for Paul, or depending on where Paul is at school. Even though he's a really happy, nice guy, the meltdowns will not look the same. And people who have never seen one will be surprised at how violent he can become.
When a meltdown occurs, teachers need to know what to do, what supports are in place, and be ready to act.
Together, if we come up with a system,
there needs to be a plan. The general ed teacher needs to know what that plan is, and within that plan, that teacher needs to know, when do I send the child out of the classroom? Where do the other kids go? Who are they supervised by? Who is going to help me if the child has a meltdown? And what should I do during that meltdown?
During a meltdown, teachers should keep one fundamental rule in mind.
Keep everybody safe. I mean, that's really the issue. Oftentimes you have to remove everybody because it's too difficult to, especially when you're talking about high school. You know, if you're talking about a 15-year-old, 175-pound man, you're not removing him. You have to remove everybody else.
For teachers, having a plan and implementing it properly is critical to helping a student who's suffering a meltdown regain control.
The last thing you want is for the individual with autism to have a meltdown or a tantrum or a behavior problem, because those things are hard to recover from. His classmates start to think he's got a problem that is bigger than it really is. And so there are things that the gen ed teacher should know to do that will help keep the participant with autism sort of on a level ground.
Take it from a parent of a student with autism. Teachers can make all the difference when it comes to helping prevent meltdowns from occurring in the first place.
The teachers that work well with Paul know him. They watch his face. They watch his body language. They don't just wait for words to come out of his mouth, because by then it's done. You're already in a frustrating episode.
All right, so that kind of talks a little bit about, you know, what to do during a meltdown. And one piece of that, Sherry Moyer wrote a book called The Eclipse Model. I mentioned her earlier, and she had some great language. When a student is in a meltdown, she had some things called magic statements that help validate students' feelings, help them acknowledge need for extra time. So some of these can also work during that rumbling stage. It really, you know, statements that instead of making the student more upset or labeling or stigmatizing the student, they really help to build more tolerance and trust and maintaining that student's dignity. So a couple of those statements really quick. One of them is, what can I do to help you make things better? Do you need a little more time to answer or finish what you were doing? I'll help you figure this out when you are calm enough to problem solve. I understand that you are upset and you have a right to your feelings. So you can kind of see those magic statements can help students as well. So reminders during the rumbling stage, maintaining safety, backing off unless the student is in danger to themselves or others, and acknowledging the feelings, but trying to reduce the verbal input and having an emergency plan. So having a team of teachers who kind of have that emergency plan and maintaining that safety. We're going to watch a little piece on the recovery phase now, what to do after the student, once they're kind of stressed, if the student is, what to do after the meltdown to help that student kind of recover.
Following a meltdown comes the third stage, recovery.
The recovery stage means simply that the behaviors exhibited during rage are no longer occurring, but the child is not ready to learn new material. He is still fragile, and if predictability in routine does not occur, he may melt down again.
There's no on-off switch with meltdowns. Once in the recovery stage, students often need help easing back into their routine. Teachers can help by directing them to highly motivating tasks that they can accomplish, such as an activity related to a special interest or that plays on a particular strength. Afterwards, the teacher should investigate the cause of the meltdown in order to develop a strategy to avoid future episodes.
There will come a time after the child is recovered where you, in essence, go through this and say, okay, what did we learn from this? How could we have avoided this? Did you feel this coming on? We call it a social autopsy. You want to go back and say, where did we make the mistakes, right? What did we do wrong? We, not just you, not the person with autism, but me as well, that could have prevented this.
So when you are looking at, you know, after the meltdown, that recovery phase, there were some ideas. In addition, in terms of teaching, so, you know, teaching after the student has calmed down, after they have fully recovered, or teaching, you know, just on a normal day when the student is doing well, there are things like social autopsies. Social autopsies are a way that you can break down specific social blunders and figure out a plan of action. Basically, a social autopsy is going to look at what happened, what did you do which may have caused it to happen, what other choices can you make, and what are some outcomes for those choices. In addition, it gives students options of choices. So if you do a social autopsy, you want to make sure that you let the student generate some different options. Now, this social autopsy, again, is going to be for those more verbal students. It's going to be harder to do for other students. I think with presuming competence and using some, if you have good communication systems in place, it's still definitely possible to do with learners at all levels. But you want to make sure, when possible, that that student has some options of choices to make. They may not be able to tell you choices that they want to make. You may have to give them some, you know, give them a couple options in which they can choose one. You're going to practice that situation, make a plan, and a big piece of it is the teacher following up, finding out how is that working. Is that working for you? A couple quick reminders during the recovery phase. You know, directing students to more motivating materials, guiding students back into a more typical routine, you know, referring them back to the schedule, and decreasing demands until the student has fully recovered can all be very helpful.
And just to add a bit, you know, as they mentioned in the video, the recovery stage is not a time to introduce new material. It's not a teaching time. It's a time to as it shows on that chart, it's to kind of ease the student back into the normal classroom routine. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So yes, making sure that we're not adding a bunch, during that recovery, a bunch of new things. We want to ease the student gently back into the routine. You know, when you do have students, some of you have said that you have students that have difficulty with behaviors and meltdowns. Highly suggest doing a functional behavior assessment. We're doing a webinar tomorrow on that, if people are interested. And just kind of making sure that we're responding consistently when we're looking at patterns, we're having discussions with families, all the caregivers, trying to figure out what's going on, and really looking at providing multiple supports for students is really critical. With stress and anxiety, I'll put this in the Google Doc folder. There's something called the stress survey schedule for persons with autism. This comes from the Groden Center, and they've you know, allowed us to use it here and are okay with people using this. It can be used as part of a functional behavior assessment, but specifically for stress and anxiety. And you can fill this out with families and educators and try to figure out kind of where the student is at in a variety of possible stress-provoking activities. And there's, I think, about 3 or 4 pages. There's several. This is just a kind of excerpt to give you an idea of what it looks like. But you kind of rate where a student is at. And this can really help you plan around supports for specific students. And then this other piece that's very important is going to be teaching students to self-regulate. So let's go ahead and watch this piece that talks about the importance of teaching these self-regulation strategies.
Given the nature of autism, students on the spectrum are not necessarily intuitive learners. They need explicit instruction in order to learn how to understand their feelings, manage their behaviors, and ultimately prevent meltdowns.
They need direct instruction on all of those facets of recognizing behaviors in self and how to incorporate strategies. And we typically do that by behavior, and we will teach our kids that, you know, when you begin to swing your leg, that means that you are overwhelmed. And when you are overwhelmed, here's a strategy that you can use.
While some older students may have already developed healthy coping skills by the time they enter your classroom, it's important for you to continue building on those strengths as part of a proactive approach to managing behavior.
People on the spectrum, by the time they get to high school, both hopefully have been taught some self-awareness. They also know their own warning signs. So, the two most important things are proactively implement the proactive plan and know the warning signs, so that if the child, the teenager, needs to get out of the environment, let them out.
For teachers, an effective way to address challenging behaviors considers the individual student in the context of the classroom.
I think knowing the student, knowing his strengths, knowing his areas where he's got the most difficulties, and then proactively addressing that will result in the best outcome.
All right. Another quick resource, great for students at any levels, is the incredible 5-point scale. It really helps inform teachers about students' individual anxiety and triggers. This is kind of an example of the way the 5-point scale looks generally, but it can be used for all types of things. Here's one, a 5-point scale for anxiety levels. So you have students talk about, being able to say, here's my strategies. When I'm in a level 1, here's how I feel, and this is what, I don't need any supports when I'm in a level 1. But maybe when I'm in a level 4, I'm about to have a meltdown or I'm about to have difficulty, that's when there's a strategy that might assist me. And again, kind of teaching this to students at various levels, if they have those routines that they can initiate, even if they're handing you a visual card to initiate needing to take a break or do these things, this 5-point scale can be useful. You can have 5-point scales so students can self-identify how they're feeling in the morning, and that gives you an idea of how to start out working with the student or when they come into your classroom. This is more of a kind of something you might see in a PBIS school, talking about how loud a voice should be. So you can create 5-point scales for all kinds of things. You can create 5-point scales for how much help you need. So a student may not they may not be able to tell you they need help, but if you had this laying out, they could probably point to it, and it would give you an idea of how much scaffolding or how much assistance you may need to do with the student in the classroom. One more, as far as team collaboration, I've also seen people use a 5-point scale as a team to say, what are we going to do? That big piece of having a plan in place for students, this is a great way to use a 5-point scale for the team working with the students, so that we know we are only going to use the most severe. In Wisconsin, we have a state law around seclusion and restraint, and the only time it's allowed to be used is if the student is imminent and immediate danger of injuring themselves or others. So that would only be used if the student was about to hurt themselves. But if a student was having a meltdown, then of number 4, where they're not in danger of themselves or others, that's when staff has, kind of agreed, this is what we're going to do for that student. We're going to stay back. We might use some magic statements. We may try to say some things or back off on the verbal. Just state something that maintains the student's dignity, lets them know that we'll be there to help, but then, kind of back off until the student is calmed down. And there's some great, on the Autism Internet Module's website, there's a really nice video of the 5-point scale. As we're kind of getting closer to the end here, here's a nice piece on families and the importance of talking with families. And there's a really good example up here of when you have that strong communication between family and school, how that can really help the staff understand that student and know what their triggers are.
One way to reduce the possibility of meltdowns is to maintain open lines of communication with parents.
The formula is really simple. The teacher and I have to talk a lot. They get to know Paul through me, and I get to know what's expected of him through the teacher. because there are always different expectations in each classroom. And the teacher sees Paul and calls me up and asks some questions. I saw Paul doing this the other day in class. What does that mean? Oh, that's not good. That means that he's really nervous about something. Try this, this, or this.
We go over how he's rule-oriented, how he thrives with structure, different procedures that worked in the past.
Develop a relationship with the parent. Develop a dialogue. I mean, the goal of any teacher is the success of the student, period. End of sentence. Doesn't matter who the child is. And that's what the parent's goal is. They want what's best for their child. If you want that child to succeed, if you build a partnership, the child will be successful.
Okay, so go that way.
If there's a certain student that tends to have meltdowns, and we know it either coming into the school year or we find out shortly on, we do tend to have meetings with parents to talk about what strategies have worked for their children.
A lot of teachers don't want you to feel bad because your child has behaviors in school. Tell me everything so that I know how to help you as a teacher and you know how to help myself.
All right. And in Wisconsin, here's a slide with a lot of parent support organizations. I know there's some great organizations like WISPE. I'm the grant director for the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, and we have family engagement coordinators that work in each of the CESAs across the state to help build relationships between families and educators. There's also great groups out there like Wisconsin Family Ties and Wisconsin Facets that are education-related agencies that help provide information to schools and families on how to work with students that may have a lot of difficulties in school. In addition, there's some really good resources. One of the things for secondary students looking at that transition age, there's CSESA, it's also pronounced CESA. I would recommend looking at that. It's a new grant site. They're actually looking for grant sites in Wisconsin, so if you're interested in that, if you want to send me an email, they're looking for sites in high schools that are interested in doing evidence-based practice for students with autism around transition. There's also some good other national sites there that you can look at information, Rights Law and IDA partnership. And then as we kind of close out this last video, just have some reflections of teachers talking about the benefits of having students on the spectrum in their classrooms. So we'll watch this one.
The specialized knowledge and unique abilities of students with autism can expand the learning experience for both students and teachers beyond the academic realm.
Having a student with autism in the class can teach typically developing students that there are differences and embrace the differences. Nobody's normal. There's no one normal person. Everybody's got their own quirks, and that's what makes everybody interesting. And so this is just another dynamic of interesting. And so I think that that kind of helps them embrace differences.
Children with autism will expand your way of thinking if you listen and if you ask the right questions and if they feel confident and accepted enough to volunteer and answer. You will find that the quality and richness of what you teach is increased by answers and ideas they can bring to the table.
Ultimately, with students on the autism spectrum in their classroom, teachers have the opportunity to reinforce a broader lesson to all their students.
If we can make sure that part of what fellow students in a classroom learn about a person with autism is some of the ways in which they might be similar, some of the interests that they share, some of the activities that they also enjoy. I think it goes a long way toward building, first of all, a more comprehensive understanding of this person, but also a bridge to, thinking, well, we're not just different from each other, we're also similar to each other.
And I think that's a nice, as we kind of wind down here, a nice kind of sentiment there. There's some great resources out there for continued, a lot of the evidence-based practices that you'll find are on the Autism Internet Module's website. There's also a website for the Incredible 5-Point Scale. In addition, and Ben, I don't know, if you want to talk about, in addition to these videos, you're developing some professional development curriculum as well.
Yeah, So as I mentioned before, we worked with a large school system here in the Washington, D.C. area on the actual videos, but we're kind of expanding that package of information to support teacher training. So we've already worked with, actually you have a great slide up there, we've worked with CISA and the folks at the University of North Carolina to do a supplementary manual that you can also download. It's on the Google Doc that goes along with the video that folks can either use to follow along or they can use it as a handy reference for after viewing the videos for during the school year. And then we're also working with the folks from CISA on a model curriculum. So finding ways to use all 4 of these video segments and build in activities, kind of like what we did today. Build in activities to account for different time availabilities. So if you've only got half an hour in your professional development day, the model curriculum will be able to accommodate for that. If you have a 2-hour block, we'll be able to accommodate for that as well. And my hope is that this will be available in the early part of 2014. But for now, we've got great foundational information in the video, and great organizations like Wisconsin DPI and others who have taken this foundational information, created their own presentations based on it to support the specific needs of their teachers and their students. But the model curriculum that we're developing is just going to be, again, to kind of support that process. So if you sign up for our newsletter, if you stay connected on our website, we'll be reporting on that in the coming months.
And how do people sign up for the newsletter at OAR? Is that on the website?
It is on the website, yep. If you go on our website, it's right up at the top. There's a green bar with a bunch of different choices, and one of those is resources, and one of the options is newsletters. And we publish a newsletter every month, and anything from new projects that we're working on, research that we funded. We fund about 7 to 10 studies a year. We always report on the findings of those studies, how-to articles from parents, from teachers, news from the autism community. We report on a lot of different things. It's a great resource and definitely a way to stay connected. Oh, and you got the website right there.
Here's the website, and if you're interested in watching these videos, I've sent the link throughout, but if you go to the main page of the autism website, you have the subscribe to the e-news up there, and then it's the Understanding Autism DVD, and all of the videos are right here. We watched the first one and the third one today, and I do apologize. There was a segment around the meltdowns where we lost our connection, and I kind of just trooped on through that. But I appreciate participation today throughout some of the technical difficulties we had. Just knowing that we do have some 2-day autism trainings in Wisconsin still coming up, some great ones by Mary Kate and Judy. If you've not ever attended, I highly recommend the Basic Needs on Commonwealth on January 28th, 29th, February 25th and 26th, Addressing Challenging Behaviors. In addition, the webinars that we're doing, we have several coming up. Tomorrow there's one on functional behavior assessment, and you may have received an invitation to that. If not, it's still not too late to sign up. Just send me an email. In addition, Ben and I will be coming back and doing some more on the OAR resources on November 21st. So I really want to thank Rachel and Sue for chiming in on some of the things that they're doing around helping students with autism in the classrooms around Wisconsin, and as well as thanking Ben for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But at this time, we've reached 5:30, and I just want to thank everyone again for your participation.